I don't know whether it will become law, but it is another sign of the ridiculousness of American politics, I'm afraid. There is a kind of anti-China hysteria. This is part of American politics. There's also a sub-theme that TikTok must be controlled so that terrible messaging on TikTok is not permitted. So there's a lot of fear and paranoia and anti-China sentiment wrapped up in this. We don't know these days what will actually become law, what is merely for public consumption before elections this November. So I can't
Right.
give you a prediction, but I can tell you that it is absurd.
We've seen some opponents to the TikTok divestment bill. They're claiming that if the bill is passed, it will violate the First Amendment of the US Constitution. Do you think that sort of argument has its basis? Do you agree?
Well, this is definitely an attempt to control the media, and it's based on a lot of fear and
Hmm.
misrepresentation. There are things lurking in the legislation that could give government more and more control that would be undesirable. So I'm hoping that the whole thing dies and that is kind of a publicity stunt, but not a real initiative. We shall see.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because while the government is suppressing TikTok, we have seen US President Joe Biden's re-election campaign. They actually launched an official TikTok account last month. And White House responded by claiming that the Biden administration's policy on TikTok hasn't changed. How do we understand this sort of seemingly inconsistent behavior?
Well, I wouldn't say that consistency is a hallmark of politics or a hallmark of U.S. politics. So none of this is surprising. There's a lot of hypocrisy. There's a lot of fear mongering. There's a lot of grandstanding. None of it stands up to rational scrutiny.
Donald Trump, meanwhile, said he opposed the bill.
Well, that will certainly have its effect on Republican members of Congress. Trump is the clear leader of the Republican Party. He is their nominee. He has a very good chance of being reelected president. And so what he says matters in this.
But it could all just be election rhetoric that could be gone within months.
I think it's a little bit more than that because the anti-China sentiments transcend mere election politics. They are stoked more during the election period, but we're in a not very thoughtful phase of American politics that now is more than 10 years old, in which the American political class views China as a threat and a danger and acts, in my view, in irrational ways that make the situation worse.
Now, how do you think this year's election is going to impact Sino-US relations?
Well, first I'll tell you, as I'm sure you know, the overwhelming sentiment in the United States is, my God, this is our two choices. People are not happy with this at all. They want a different option because they're not happy with having to see this rerun between Biden, who's now 81 years old, Trump, 77, I believe. None of them spring chickens. It's actually time for new leadership and a new generation, aside from the fact that each of these two candidates has very high disapproval ratings with the public compared to the approval ratings. So this is not a case of two popular politicians going after each other. This is a case where the American people are asking what is happening to our political system that delivers candidates we do not want. And this remains to be seen how this will be played out this year.
In the State of the Union address, President Biden emphasized the U.S.'s support for Ukraine. I know you said in a recent article that Biden and Schumer want to throw more Ukrainians' lives and more tens of billions of dollars at this glaring failure. You've also mentioned that Ukraine's security can only be achieved at the negotiating table and not by some fantasizing military triumph over Russia. Would you please elaborate for us? Why do you make such a conclusion?
When the Soviet Union was dissolved in December 1991, the American deep state took that as the moment of unipolarity, that now the United States can do what it wants, where it wants. And it decided on a strategy of expanding the U.S. military alliance as far and wide as possible. In the European context, that meant the expansion of NATO. As the Soviet Union disbanded its military alliance, which had been called the Warsaw Pact, NATO expanded into the former Warsaw Pact countries. Similarly, in East Asia, we know that the United States built new alliances and aimed to strengthen its military presence in the South China Sea region, throughout the rim of countries surrounding China. This was part of the same idea that America is the unipolar power. It should not be face competition by Russia, by China, or by any other part of the world. It was a policy of arrogance. It was bound to result in confrontation with Russia and, of course, with rising tensions with China, because if you keep pushing your alliance up to the borders of the other country, naturally you're going to create threats. By the time the NATO enlargement reached Ukraine, which is a 2,000-kilometer border with Russia, and two countries that have a very intertwined history for hundreds of years, the Russian political class said, no, stop, no farther. We don't want you, NATO, we don't want you, the United States, on our border. But the United States' attitude was, who cares what Russia thinks? We are the superpower. Russia is some second-rate regional power. That was the American attitude, even explicitly stated that way by President Obama at one point. So the United States continued to push. It helped to engineer a coup in Ukraine in February 2014 that overthrew a president that wanted neutrality for Ukraine to install a government that wanted NATO for Ukraine. And the war broke out at that point 10 years ago. It's been going on since then. I have repeatedly said the United States should acknowledge expanding NATO to Ukraine was a dangerous and unjustified idea, and one that was viewed by Russia as an existential threat, and therefore one that Russia would not allow. So I've said to the American leadership and public repeatedly, acknowledge that NATO will not expand to Ukraine, and then we can have peace in Ukraine. But the United States political class has not been willing to accept that kind of self-constraint. So until today, even now, hundreds of thousands of people dead, the United States continues to push for NATO enlargement. And just recently, the Secretary General of NATO, Mr. Jens Stoltenberg, said, Ukraine will join NATO. To my point of view, this means ongoing war. It means ongoing destruction of Ukraine. It's something that can never be achieved because Russia will fight absolutely to prevent it. And if there were rational and sane people that were thinking about the real interest of Ukraine and the interest of the world, on the Western side, they would say, you know, this whole thing has been a bad idea. We stopped the NATO enlargement. We opened direct talks with Russia. We find a way to make peace in Ukraine. This is possible until today.
Who is benefiting in the U.S. from continuing the war in Ukraine?
Broadly speaking, of course, nobody benefits from war if we think about the overall common good. The world has suffered.
Of course.
Ukraine has suffered the most. Europe has suffered very badly. It's in open recession now because Europe lost its normal economic trade with Russia. In the United States, the public is very unhappy. Most of the public wants all of this to end. Biden is not winning any public support for the position on Ukraine. So broadly speaking, nobody wins from an ongoing war like this. But of course, there are pockets of profiteering in war. The military-industrial complex, our major companies like Northrop Grumman or Boeing are, of course, seeing increased arms contracts, and they defend this. There are a lot of institutions, especially in the East Coast of the United States where I live, even at the universities and the Washington think tanks, that are basically funded by the military-industrial complex. So they come out for the war. The politicians say to themselves, you know, I have arms manufacturers in my district. That's jobs in my district. I also get campaign contributions, they say to themselves, from the military-industrial companies. So they side with this. It's a bit of a game. I've called it a scam, a corruption of American foreign policy by these private interests. So the question, who gains? Basically, the world loses, but a small group does profiteer from the war and from the warmongering.
What do you think of the US's military spending? For example, in the year 2024, I believe there is a 886, I think the number is billion US dollars of military spending planned. What do you think of that figure?
Well, first of all, the figure is an underestimate because that counts only what's in the Pentagon budget. There is nuclear weapons spending in the Department of Energy. There is the so-called Homeland Security budget. There is the CIA and intelligence agencies budget. And then there's a big ticket, very sad one, called the Veterans Administration, which pays for all the disabled American veterans who have lost limbs or suffered other disasters, often lifelong, from war. That's hundreds of billions of dollars in addition. So we're well over $1 trillion a year. And this spending has gone to the wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Ukraine, also the roughly 800 U.S. military bases around the world. It's a colossal waste of money. It leads to war, it leads to suffering, it leads to instability, and it has been a major factor in the accumulation of public debt in the United States. None of this is popular with the American people, so the politicians don't go to the public and say, this is so important, you have to pay taxes. No. What they do is they say, it doesn't cost you anything. We'll borrow to finance this $1 trillion. So we have a huge budget deficit, a rising debt, an unpopular policy, and this is our current situation. Of course, it stokes an arms race with China. It stokes an arms race with other countries, because if we had normal relations with China, if we had normal relations with Russia, we would all say, better that we keep our military spending low and that we don't antagonize each other. We don't threaten each other. We don't need to waste all of this money on armaments because we're not a threat to each other. That's the kind of world we should be aiming for.
In the meantime, we have a lot of foreign media, Western media, that say China is spending too much on its military budget. China's figure being about 1/4 of what is reported, as I just quoted, of what US is spending.
Yes, you know, China has increased its military budget, but it is a fraction of the U.S. And if both sides would actually, if we would talk with each other, if the United States had not launched another very bad idea called AUKUS, which is a new military alliance of the U.S., UK, and Australia, for example. Oh, what a waste of money, waste of time, threat to China, useless for all of us, useless. If we had not gone that way, we wouldn't need all of this increase of military spending. So I really put the onus on the United States, which has been spending more than the next 10 countries combined on military spending, to stop wasting our own money in the United States, and to say to the rest of the world, we can move back to a situation of arms control and normal diplomatic relations rather than confrontation. This is, of course, what we need.
The dollar's share of global reserves is expected to continue its trend of slipping as emerging market and developing economies are seeking further diversification in the currency composition of their reserves. What is going on? What's wrong with the dollar? Will it become stronger or weaker going forward?
Over time, the share of international transactions in the dollar will surely diminish. And that could happen faster than people expect. Right now, rough estimates say that about 60% of all international trade and financial settlements occur in dollars. And by occurring in dollars, it means occurring in the international banking system that deals in dollars, mainly in Europe and in the so-called SWIFT settlements. The problem is twofold, actually threefold. One is that the relative share of the U.S. in the world economy is falling gradually, but it's declining, and it's going to continue to decline. So why should so much of the world's transactions be in dollars? The second is that there are new technologies for making settlements, such as digital central bank currencies, which China, the People's Bank of China, has been experimenting with in recent years, and I think will continue to develop. This means you don't have to go through the banking system in the same way for settlements, and certainly not the U.S. banking system. But the third problem is that the United States came to view this important role of the dollar as a weapon of foreign policy. Look at the freeze of Russian financial assets, $300 billion frozen of Russian assets because the United States said so, basically. Russia is not alone. This has happened to Afghanistan, to Iran, to Venezuela, to North Korea, to others. The United States decides unilaterally that your assets are our assets now, that you can't use the dollar trading system. And of course, countries are waking up to this vulnerability. Who wants to have their reserves confiscated? Who wants to be blocked from international trade because there isn't an alternative mechanism? So the aim of the BRICS this year is, in fact, to develop non-dollar payments mechanisms.
Right.
My experience and view is this is not so hard. So I think that there will be ways to settle in renminbi. There will be ways to settle in rupees. There will be ways to settle in rubles. There will be perhaps a new unit of account established to facilitate non-dollar settlements. I think the BRICS will come up with some interesting ideas this year, and that will accelerate the shift out of dollars.
And Professor Sachs, you predicted that the hegemony of the US dollar will end within, I think you said, 10 years. How does this time frame of a decade come about? What makes you decide it's 10 years?
Of course, it's a guess. So let me be clear about that, because nobody can predict the future with the accuracy at a time like this. But my view is that the idea that the dollar must be used is a great exaggeration. There are many economists, my counterparts, who say, well, there is no alternative. This I do not believe. My own experience is that the currency is not the fundamental part of an economy. It's the mechanism for settling transactions. And it can happen in many different currencies. You can invent the euro. You can internationalize the renminbi. You can create even new currencies. I've been involved in that in 2 countries, helping governments to introduce new national currencies. So my view is that it's easier than it looks to make the workaround from the dollar. Of course, if the U.S. foreign policy changed and became far more cooperative and trustworthy, maybe the U.S. dollar would sustain a longer reign as the dominant currency. But if the relations between the US, China, Russia, and others remain very fraught, there will be substitutes. That's my main point. And they will be easier to come up with than is currently believed. And it will happen faster than is currently believed. And my example, I would say, of justifying that view is that the US believed that the sanctions against Russia would kill the Russian economy. Of course, it did nothing of the sort. It was based on an exaggerated view of the centrality of the dollar. It was based on an exaggerated view of what the cost would be of cutting Russia out of the SWIFT banking system. But the US did it. Russia more than survived this. It shows that alternatives can be created even from 1 month to the next, basically. It doesn't even take 10 years in that regard.